Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
I mentioned earlier on at the top of the programme, she's an international freelance journalist, a very good journalist. We hear and see her on lots of different programmes. She's been on RT quite a bit, talking about her experiences travelling around Gaza particularly, where she's done some incredible reporting from that part of the world in very difficult circumstances for the people of Gaza, it has to be said as well. Very recently, she was travelling in Syria, working and travelling and documenting what's going on in Syria, and is only back just a few short weeks. You can find out more about her and read all about her at the website ingaza.wordpress.com. Go to ingaza.wordpress.com. I'll tweet that out now while we're having a chat. Let's welcome to the programme, all the way from Ontario in Canada, Eva Bartlett. Eva, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you so much, Richie.
It's great to have you on, Eva. I mean that. So tell us about travelling in Syria then. Why were you there recently? That's a good way to start, really. Then we'll get into talking about what you saw and what you documented. Why were you there?
I was there as I was for prior visits to Syria, which my first visit was in April 2014. And the idea was, to go in solidarity with the Syrian people and also to witness with your own eyes and to hear what the Syrian people there have to say, as opposed to what the corporate narrative on Syria is. Because, as you know, the corporate media totally ignores the will of the Syrian people, and they take, representatives from exile or Saudi-backed representatives as word of the Syrian people. So when I've gone there, I've been able to visit certain key areas in Syria and actually just talk with the people and ask them, what do they believe is going on? What do they want? And their answers are very clear and as simple as you would imagine. They understand that what is happening in Syria it's a foreign war on Syria designed to topple their government and serve certain agendas in certain neighboring countries like so-called Israel. And they also adamantly support their president, their government, and they support their Syrian army, the Syrian Arab army. And these are all narratives that you wouldn't hear in the corporate media. So if you go there and you talk with people, you hear those narratives, and also you see the devastation, the terrorism they've been exposed to, whether it's car bombings, which I've gone to different neighborhoods that have been exposed to car bombings, terrorist car bombings, or whether it's the terrorist mortars and rockets that rain down on various areas of Damascus, of Aleppo, of countries all over Syria. From wherever there are terrorist hotbeds, they send dirty mortars and hell cannons onto civilian areas in a way to punish them for whatever reason, for their support of the government or for simply not taking their side in this foreign war on Syria. So my main objective has been to bear witness and foremost to transmit what Syrians tell me, what I witness and what they tell me, what they want the Western or the world outside of Syria to actually know and hear.
Now, I'm not asking this question. I am asking it, but I'm not asking it because I know quite a lot about you from researching you. And we spoke years ago when I was working on the radio in Spain, believe it or not. It was quite a long time ago, and it wasn't a very long interview either, when I was working in Marbella for Talk Radio Europe. And I think what you do is brilliant. But your critics would say, well, Eva, you might be a terrific journalist, you might be a great writer, you're certainly a great photographer. There's no doubt about that. Congratulations to you. But you've got an objective, Eva. You're not. In fact, you don't have objectivity. You're subjective in what you're trying to cover because you've got your own deep-rooted personal opinions on what's happening to these countries. How do you address that? What do you say to people when they say that to you?
My personal opinions are based on analysis, are based on fact, are based on the credible reports of various journalists, and based on speaking to the people who are involved in these countries, who are suffering from this Western, Saudi, Israeli, NATO war, for example, on Syria. So you could accuse me of having biases, and eventually, I do have biases towards justice and towards truth. But I mean, I don't come from any sort of personal background. I have no family or religious affiliation with either Syria or Palestine or Yemen or any of these countries that are being hammered by NATO's mercenaries or by Saudi criminals. But what I do have is the ability to look beyond the corporate media. And we'll get into some of the media lies, but we know for a fact, even if we go back to Iraq, you know for a fact that the corporate media has been part of the propaganda machine which sells these foreign wars. So everybody, I think, at least by now, should remember the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter posing as a nurse and crying about throwing babies from the incubators, right? And so if this has happened in Iraq and it's happened in Libya, why can people not believe that the same media lies and the same governmental and UN and NGO lies are happening in Syria? Because they are.
Brilliant. Great answer. You're absolutely spot on. And we know this to be true historically. You went in 2014 and then you went a few weeks back. I imagine the changes in the country from your first to your second visit were pretty startling. Eva, how does anybody, how does a young man or a young woman cope with seeing some of the things that you've had to see? And I know you saw some horrendous things in Gaza during one of the Israeli operations to try and bomb Gaza back to the Stone Age. I know you were there to see that. You were covering that while it was happening. How do you cope with that? How do you deal with some of the things you have to see?
Well, in the end, it's not about me. I mean, I just feel that the issues that we're all looking at, whether it's, again, Syria, which gets more coverage than, say, Yemen, which gets no coverage whatsoever, the point is that the people who are suffering are some of the most remarkably steadfast and remarkable people. I mean, I would say that anybody who, like me, has gone to or in some capacity worked with the people who are being oppressed in Syria and Palestine and Yemen and Libya, where else, most people, I would imagine, would comment the same thing, that I think they would actually take solace and take, what's the word I'm looking for, inspiration from these people, because they're the ones that are truly suffering, whereas, we in the West, most people, I mean, we have our own battles and we're struggling for different things here, but, we don't really know the extent of suffering. And when I go to Syria or Palestine and I meet with people who have suffered so immensely, and they meet you with such graciousness and such resilience, to continue living, to continue, having children, getting married, celebrating in what way they can, that, for me, it's truly humbling and also inspiring. So, you could take the example of like a doctor or a medic who has to put their own personal feelings on hold in order to get the task done. And I think that's what most of us do. Is it's excruciating when you really think about it. And at times it's overwhelming. Like, for example, when I was last in Syria, I went to Al-Zahra in Homs, which has been ravaged by NATO's terrorist car bombings and suicide bombings. And you meet the people and you see the resilience and their defiance to continue living. But there's also a deep pain, obviously, because they've lost repeatedly under these bombings and attacks. They've lost loved ones and friends. So it is emotional. It is hard. But first and foremost, you have to take inspiration from the people who are suffering.
And I suppose you don't want to show people whom are struggling in that way, you don't want to show that you're breaking down and that you're suffering, an emotional reaction to seeing it. But I guess when you get home and you have time to think after you've posted articles and uploaded films and pictures, I imagine in the cold light of day you start to think back to what you saw, and it must have an effect on you. But we can leave that there. I mean, I won't say I understand what you're talking about, because I've never experienced it as a journalist, and I don't know if I ever will. I don't know if I ever want to experience that, to see that sort of situation and to see what's happening to people up close and personal in that way. Let's talk about some of the big claims made after the, let's be honest about it, the CIA, MI6, Mossad-sponsored fake revolution in Syria in 2011. We were told very early on, of course, that rather than go after those who were opposing him and his government, that Assad's army started indiscriminately attacking civilians in various cities in Syria. We then heard the chemical weapons story. We then heard that he was barrel bombing his own people. It must be said again that those accusing him of these crimes never provided a shred of evidence to the international community to back it up. It must be said, evidence doesn't matter to the media. You, of course, Eva, being a real journalist, you went looking for evidence that Assad was indiscriminately murdering anybody whom he thought was against him in Syria. What's the real story?
Well, the real story, as you properly noted at the beginning, that this is, a NATO alliance war on Syria, is that for example, I always make a note that I'm not an analyst, but what I do is look at actual journalists and analysts who've done a good job of documenting, and there's a number of people that have done a good job of documenting and refuting these lies. But with respect to the initial lies of so-called unarmed protest and the Syrian forces allegedly gunning down unarmed protesters, that's patently false, and that's been documented and refuted time and again, whether it's articles like Professor Tim Anderson's many articles on the initial protest and this fake revolution, or Sharmeen Narwani's articles on different massacres that occurred at the hands of these terrorists that at that time were not labeled at whatever so-called moderate terrorist sect that they are now. These massacres of Syrian security forces, these are all documented. And then you talk with people who are from Syria and live in the areas that were purportedly coming under governmental fire, and whether it's Homs or Latakia, you get a different narrative. And I've had many Assyrian tell me, they watched Al Jazeera, and Al Jazeera would be reporting that the Syrian government, the army was supposedly massacring people, and the people in that area would say to their relatives, for example, a friend in Toronto talked with her relative in Homs, and she said, I'm watching Al Jazeera, but this is not happening. This is false.
Wow.
And this has happened time and time again. I talked with a friend that's living in Latakia, and she said the same thing. And she cited an LA Times report. I don't remember what year or date, but she said essentially they were alleging all these things were happening in Latakia. And she said she was out in Latakia that day. She went to pretty much all the places that this report cited. The reporter, of course, being based in Beirut or LA. And none of the things that were being alleged were happening. So, with respect to the narrative of government forces cracking down on unarmed protesters, it's completely false. And we know now that there were protesters in various areas of Syria, not just Dara, but also Homs, also, murdering one of the first prominent people that are well-known people to be murdered was Nidal Janud, who was publicly marched, through town. He was from outside of Latakia, and he was marched from Banias, and he was marched through town. His face was gashed open by these so-called unarmed protesters, and he was beaten to death.
Jesus, yeah.
Yeah, so all these stories have been refuted. And then, throughout the last 5 years, you've had ridiculous assertion after ridiculous assertion, which have, again, been refuted, whether it's chemical weapons, which finally was proven to have come from the terrorists that the West likes to call moderate rebels, or massacres that, again, the massacres in Latakia, when they happened, most of the corporate media, BBC, corporate media, Al Jazeera, would blame the Syrian government. But then with some investigation, they found out, no, in fact, it could only have happened by the terrorists that they like to call rebels. And they had, numerous people who were willing to testify to that. But when you take the chemical weapons allegations, they which were false, they relied on photographs, for example, photographs of children that were abducted, most likely from the outskirts of Latakia by the terrorists, and they were actually staged. Whether the children were drugged or dead, we don't know. They were actually staged in different areas and purported to have been gassed by the Syrian army. And some of the investigations that looked into these allegations found, child A is found in 2 different locations. How is this possible?
How is it possible, yeah.
How is it possible unless the child has been used?
Can I ask you on that, Eva? Sorry to interrupt you. Can I ask you on that? You must have come across or bumped into other journalists while you were there, journalists working for newspapers or magazines or news organisations. And if you did, how difficult is it to, to be in the same space, in the same room, in the same town as these people, knowing that they're deliberately manipulating. They're not manipulating the truth. That's a pathetic thing to say. They're just lying through their teeth. How do you deal with that?
It's immensely infuriating, to be honest. I can think of one prominent journalist that most people would know, and that's Canadian Lise Doucet, who now works for the British Bullshit Corporation.
Yeah, you can say bullshit. Absolutely right, yeah. Go ahead. Yeah,
so when I was first in Syria with an international peace delegation in April 2014, after the delegation, many of the delegates had left, and some of us stayed on, and then I was able to stay on still more. But while some of the delegates were still there, terrorists shelled a school in Damascus, not for the first time. So some of us went to the French hospital to visit these children because, primarily it was children who were injured because it was a school that was shelled. And Mother Agnes Mariam was with us, and she actually had a conversation with Lise Doucet, and I recorded that conversation because Mother Agnes Mariam, who has done a lot of incredible and brave work in Syria, was basically saying to Lise, are you going to report the truth? You're here, you've seen the same children we've seen, you know that this came from terrorist mortar shelling, are you going to report the truth? And Lise was nodding her head, yes, 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 and I recorded this, and it's on my blog. And some weeks later, someone sent me a link to Lisa's final report in which she mentioned the children. You know, it was very sad, but she implied that it was impossible to know who could have done the shelling and, you know, with a heavy implication that it was quite likely the government.
Yeah.
But I have friends that are in the National Defense Forces, and I was asking them, I wrote an article about the mortars. I called it the terrorism we support in Syria. And I was asking him because I don't know anything about weaponry, and I just said, like, how can you tell if it's a terrorist mortar? Of course, it usually is. But anyway, he said, well, you can tell by the angle at which the mortar strikes. You can tell by the size of the tail of the mortar and the length of the mortar itself. All that tells you about how far it can fly and from which direction it came. So these mortars came from an area, it was either Jobar or another area that was infested with NATO's terrorists. So Lise is a journalist. She could easily have done that. She deliberately, in my opinion, ignored those facts so that she could issue a report that did not condemn this terrorist mortars.
And you know, you cannot accuse a journalist of anything worse than that. And yet I have no doubt you're absolutely right. I've come across it myself so many times over the years. My background is in commercial radio. It's staggering. But it doesn't surprise me. Folks, it's 20 minutes to the top of the hour. Eva Bartlett is on the line to us from Ontario. Do check out ingaza.wordpress.com, ingaza.wordpress.com. A really good question from Sean, and I'll get to that in a second, Eva. But before we ask Sean's question, what about the size and the capability of the so-called Daesh or ISIS or ISIL or whatever people are calling them today? What sort of sense of that did you get a few weeks ago in Syria? How big are these guys?
I think that's not really possible to know how big they are because the borders of Turkey and Iraq and Jordan and occupied Palestine, otherwise known as so-called Israel, the terrorists come in and out through those borders, and this has been documented. So it's hard to know because the West and their Saudi allies are continually resupplying, replenishing terrorists. So-called Israel treats the terrorists and then sends them back into Syria. So it's hard to tell their numbers, but I think what we could look to instead is the positive developments in recent weeks and months, largely due thanks to the support, the welcome support by the Syrian government of the Russian Air Force, you know, bombing terrorist locations as the NATO alliance did not do, which has enabled the Syrian Arab army and their allies to make a lot of headway, particularly in the Aleppo region. Liberating, for example, the long, 3.5 years besieged towns of Nubal and Zahra, which again, if we're going to talk about media and what they prioritized, the media never talked about Nubal and Zahra because it didn't serve the war agenda. But these towns have been liberated, and many other towns in the Aleppo countryside have been liberated, and strategic supply lines have been cut off. So in terms of, numbers of terrorists, they're fleeing. The media is reporting tens of thousands of civilians fleeing to Turkey, fleeing Russian bombing. This is lies. These are terrorists fleeing amongst civilians, perhaps, but largely a huge number of terrorists because they've given up the fight. They can't take on the Syrian army and allies because they are no longer being supplied. But in terms of other things, like what I saw on the ground. When I was in a district of Homs called Al-War, it's one of the remaining areas. It's the only remaining area, to my knowledge, that still has some terrorists in it. You know, in April 2014, when I first went, terrorists were occupying the old city of Homs and other areas of Homs. But since then, through different deals and strategic army wins, there's only one area left, and that's Al-War. And in December 2015, there was a deal which saw hundreds of these terrorists and their families extracted and sent to different areas of Idlib. But there are still over 2,000 terrorists in Al-War. But one thing I just wanted to highlight with this, maybe if we have time, we'll get into the media lies on Madaya, but take Al-War. So just in brief, the media lies on Madai are saying the Syrian government and army are starving civilians, and this is patently false. It's the terrorists who are starving civilians. But with Al-Wayr, an area that is occupied by terrorists, the government is enabling and sending in food and medical aid. There's a bread factory right at the last checkpoint before you enter Al-Wayr, where the terrorists are. That factory is being operated by the government. The flour is provided by the government, and it's supplying the bread needs of the people inside. And when I was there, and the army people at the checkpoint were saying, it is technically a ceasefire, but at any moment they could fire because, you can't trust these terrorists. But anyway, they also pointed out, and the journalist I was with pointed out, not only are food and medical supplies being sent in, but the government is supplying the electricity and water. So they have not cut off the basics of life, even though the terrorists are there. This totally contradicts what the corporate media would have us believe on the government and the army starving people.
Yeah, it's the same script they used when talking about Gaddafi and when talking about Saddam Hussein and others. You're absolutely right. Sean wanted to ask this, and it's a very good question, this. You will know, Eva, that only last week countries convened in London under the chairmanship of David Cameron to talk about raising money to send aid to Syria. Absolutely incredible that it's not laughed out of town by the British media. We want to raise millions to bomb the bejesus out of certain parts of Syria. Now let's raise a load of money to aid the Syrian people. It's crazy. But Sean asks this, and it's a good question. Do you think this Western campaign to support the Syrian people with aid might be a covert way of getting more ammunition and more supplies to Daesh?
Absolutely. That's a fantastic question. Some of my colleagues have done a lot of excellent research into the various human rights groups that are posing as human rights groups, but are really front groups supporting terrorists. And that's a very good point. I mean, I made a list. I'm just mentioning this so that we can refer to the different players that are posing as human rights groups and aid groups. And I think he has a good point that whatever aid, you'd have to be wary. Like, how is that aid going to enter Syria? Is it going to enter via Turkey? And if so, it's a given that it's going to be supporting terrorists because that's what Turkey does. If it enters through the Syrian government, okay, well, maybe it truly is aid. But I would be skeptical that these Western nations that are actively trying to destabilize Syria and overthrow the elected government would actually be sending aid via the government. That kind of beggars belief. So I think that your listener has a good point that that the West or the UK residents in this case are being duped twice over, by first, believing that the UK wants to fight terrorism in Syria when it's actively supporting terrorism in Syria, and then twice by, scamming UK residents of money so that they can, I think your listener has a good point, perhaps arm more terrorists in Syria.
Rich Mortimer on Twitter. How you doing, Rich? The only viable option is for the Syrian government to be supported to put the country back together. You say viable, Rich. It's the only just option, but of course that's not going to happen because there are, as we say on this programme, there are Rothschild Zionist plans for the region and for Syria, and they're not just going to give up and walk away. But the Russian intervention, of course, has put a big halt to the gallop of the Western plans for Syria. You will, of course, know, Eva, I've been talking about it on this programme, that in recent days the anti-Russian propaganda has been ramped up to new levels. We're being told that the Russians are killing people whom they know to be moderate and not to be ISIS, which is basically accusing Russia of war crimes. To make matters worse, the planes are hanging around, and when people are coming to aid the injured, the Russians are firing on them as well. Now, this is one of those... I remember there's a great line in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Jennifer Grey said to Ferris Bueller, if you dried that one out, you could fertilise the lawn with it. We've heard this sort of nonsense before, haven't we? They're killing people, and they're hanging around, and they're killing those who are coming to tend to the injured. Again, there's been no proof offered. Documentary evidence, there's been no videos, no photographs, nothing. They're just telling us Russia are evil, they're doing this, and they're causing all these problems. Where's it going to end, Eva? What are Russia likely? I know you say you're not an analyst, but I know you'll have an opinion. Where's all this going to end? How serious is this going to get, do you think?
Well, you're right in saying that this has happened time and again. These accusations, for example, I remember a back and forth at I think the State Department, and the really inarticulate State Department spokeswoman was saying, accusing Russia of having bombed hospitals in the Aleppo area.
Yeah.
And a number of journalists, an RT journalist, and then Matthew Lee, who's a remarkable journalist that covers different things at the UN and State Department, were saying, okay, we'll provide the coordinates. And they couldn't, of course. In contrast, Russian intelligence and satellite imagery could provide coordinates of the alleged hospitals bombed and show that they were intact. This is a prior example, but why, I think the question people, if they really want to understand, they have to ask themselves, why would the West be escalating this campaign against Russia right now? Why would they be claiming these things? Two reasons. One, because Russia, under the invitation of the Syrian government, has been very actively targeting terrorists and supporting, as I said earlier, Syrian army advances. And two, because of these advances, this is making it less and less possible, for the West to maintain their narrative, because as soon as an area is liberated, and Western media doesn't go there, but media that goes there talks to the people. They say, thank God the Syrian army came. Thank God for Russia, because now we're free. These terrorists have been terrorizing us. So there's going to be a demonization campaign against Russia, because they're doing exactly what the international coalition said they were going to do, but obviously had no intent to do. And actually, just on a personal note, a friend, he's Syrian. He lived in Canada for a bit. Anyway, he's in Aleppo. And he sent a message saying, first of all, he wanted to say, President Assad is not exterminating his people. I'm still alive. I've not had a problem here. If anything happens to me, it's going to be through the terrorists, essentially is what he's saying. I'm paraphrasing. But he said the UN is lying about the reports on Aleppo and Syria in general. He's in Aleppo. So, I would take his word over unnamed activist or the various uncredible so-called human rights groups that the corporate media likes to rely on, whether they're, the UK one-man show SOHR, or whether they're Ken Roth of Human Rights Watch. And, just on a note of all these different lying, scheming, warmongering human rights front groups, I have a link on my blog, also on the SyriaSolidarityMovement.org blog, and I just simply called it Human Rights Front Groups Warring on Syria. And it lists the players from Avaz to Human Rights Watch to Médecins Sans Frontières, to the various less known ones that really play in heartstrings, like the Syria campaign or the White Helmets, which my colleague Vanessa Beeley, who you've had on before, I believe, has done a lot of excellent investigation into. So again, getting back to the whole anti-Russia campaign, there is no proof. There are no stats. In fact, when you ask Syrians inside Syria, not unnamed activists, but actual Syrians, or you look at some of the wonderful Syrian reporting, and there's a lot of excellent English reporting by Syrian and Lebanese journalists in Syria, and you will find that these are completely baseless accusations against Russia.
Of course, and people don't see these reports, unfortunately, unless they listen to certain independent radio and television programs. Ailco is in Holland. How you doing, Ailco? He says in today's news in Holland, there was a report that NATO is sending warships into the region to deal with smugglers, allegedly. That seems to me, says Ailco, an attempt to increase tension with the Russian ships off the Syrian coast. What do you think? Well, yes, absolutely. It's about building up tension. It's certainly not good news that that's happening. Loads of comments and questions. Sam was on to ask, Sam Bray on Twitter, how you doing, Sam? How are ISIS mainly getting their arms from? Is it through trucks, etc., through Turkey, or supply drops from the coalition? Eva, I guess you'd probably say both, but just before you do, Sean asks a good question as well. What is the end game, asks Sean, in the Middle East? Is it just to have two major superpowers there, namely Saudi Arabia and Israel, and a host of small, powerless countries, asks Sean. That's a good point. We've got about 5-6 minutes left on this, Eva, so you can take this where you want to take it.
I'd like to address the first comment question. And one thing I'd like to note also is that we should be careful not just to focus on ISIS or Daesh, as most Syrians would call them, because they are the same as the other so-called moderates, whether it's the Free Syrian Army, Jabhat al-Nusra, or any of the various terrorist factions being supported by the West and Saudi Arabia, and even behind the scenes Israel. So I prefer not just to think about Daesh, because all these other terrorist factions have committed as equally heinous crimes against Syrians. But yeah, the Western U.S. planes have accidentally airdropped supplies to terrorists, not just once, twice, thrice, but more than 5 times, which is, obviously not credible to believe that this could accidentally happen that many times. Otherwise, it's been documented by many journalists, including the late Serena Shim, who it's quite likely was killed by Turkish intelligence because she was documenting the flow of terrorists and weapons via Turkey into Syria, and then mysteriously had a so-called car accident soon after. So, but I mean, aside from her reporting, other reports have shown that, yes, supplies are being funneled in via Turkey. Of course, the border with Iraq is quite large and open, so it's easy for supplies to get in that way. If you remember last year, there was a large convoy of terrorist SUVs that tracked from Iraq into Palmyra, which I think was over 500 miles. And the U.S. coalition, with all their sophisticated satellites and, drones, etc., did nothing to stop them because they somehow missed them in the middle of an open desert. So there are various ways that terrorists and their weapons are getting into Syria. Back to the whole UK and Canada and Western crocodile tears. We must send aid to Syria. We must bring 25,000 refugees to Canada and then say we're so benevolent. I think obviously most of your listeners would agree that the real way to support Syrians is to stop the flow of terrorist weapons into Syria.
Now, what about Justin Trudeau? Because if you believe him and if you believe his office, they've said that they're pulling out. They're pulling out of the so-called coalition taking on Daesh. What do you think of that?
I don't believe him. I think
Neither do I.
I mean, to be honest, any Western government. Okay, here's the supreme irony. The West wants to talk about freedom and democracy. The people of Syria chose President Assad. Most of them love him, or else at least see him as the thing that will keep Syria united and safe and secure. And anyway, the West talks about democracy. It doesn't matter, in my opinion, which prime minister we have or which president America has. They're going to support the same Zionist and the same war and imperial policies. So Trudeau is perhaps a prettier face, a newer, younger, fresher face, but he's going to support the same war policies and the same Zionist policies as all his predecessors.
We've got about 3 minutes left, right? And then we'll have to leave it for now, but we can, of course, pick it up again real soon. So we'll finish on that point then. To leave two, massive states, massive powerful states in the region, the Saudis and Israel, and to leave a host or a bunch of powerless states. A question that came in from Sean. What do you think?
I think it's clear the NATO alliance's intent has been, as we've seen with other countries, gifted democracy and freedom by them, like Iraq and Libya. The intent is to destabilize the country, to take away its strong leadership, both in terms of leadership that is good for the country and leadership that is also allied with the axis of resistance, which obviously is against the Zionist entity. So by destabilizing these countries, by deposing or murdering their leaders, then they are taking away one less strong resistance country to Israel, and also enabling different international corporations to go in and loot the country of its resources. Syria has resisted this, and even before this foreign war on Syria began, the Syrian government resisted allowing international corporations into Syria, allowing the IMF, allowing any of the things that the West or the imperial system has used to basically own countries all over the world. Syria resisted that, and they continue to resist the terrorism. And I'd like to be hopeful that with all the advances they've made in recent months and continue to make, and the support of Russia, and I'd like to think growing awareness amongst the Western public, although it's very difficult because of all the media lies. But I'd like to think that Syria is going to prevail and will be noted in history as a state that resisted all these imperialist Zionist projects. And, I'd like to think that the terror the Syrians are suffering now will stop and they can resume. Because, no country, no people should be suffering in this way. You go to Syria and you find a cultured, educated people with an immense history, and who are very welcoming, obviously, and they have. They don't deserve what's being inflicted upon them. And at the same time, they are willing to resist, and they are aware exactly what's going on. And it's my belief they will continue resisting, and hopefully this will eventually have to stop when the imperialists realize that their little plan isn't going to work.
It's a brilliantly positive way to leave it, Eva. Appreciate that. Go to ingaza.wordpress.com, folks, to find out more about Eva. Be inviting you back on the programme again soon. Thanks very much for your time, Eva.
Thank you, Richie. And I'd like to also just mention our website, the Syria Solidarity Movement.org.
Certainly. Is that the Syria Solidarity Movement.org?
Sorry, it's Syria Solidarity Movement.
Syria Solidarity Movement.org. I'll tweet that out now, and I'll encourage it to be retweeted. Yeah.
There's an imposter UK group going by the same name. They are not us, and hopefully soon they will cease to exist. But at the time being, just be aware that there is a UK group that's supporting the NATO narrative, and that's not us.
All right, Eva. Thanks for coming on again. Great to chat with you.
Thank you.
Continued success to you. Eva Bartlett on the line to us there from Ontario in Canada.